Okay, everyone, let's get started. It's 11:02 Eastern Daylight Time, and I am Karen Trivett. I'm the senior co-chair of the International Archival Affairs section of SAA. And on behalf of our section leadership, I want to welcome you all to another installment of our Archival Landscape seminars. For those of you who are just joining us for the first time, I just want to remind you that the Landscapes virtual seminar series actually began in 2020. And in each seminar, an international guest speaker introduces audiences to issues and advancements in their local context while describing the history, operating environment, and unique aspects of archival practice in their country or region. Just a few housekeeping points. Please mute your microphones and close video transmission if you haven't already. That'll help free up some bandwidth for our speaker. And feel free to write any questions in the chat box. While we will address as many of those as possible at the end of today's program, we want to give our guest as much time as possible to present. So, speaking of our guest, with us today is Mr. Stephen Urgola, currently the University Archivist at the American University in Cairo, and he will present a Nile View, a glimpse of archives in Egypt. I'm already ready to go there, Steve. So welcome to you. I will pause our program when we have 15 minutes remaining and then segue to Q&A. And for now, the floor is yours, Steve.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for having me, and happy St. Patrick's Day, which is not exactly a traditional holiday in Egypt. And based on the reports on the weather I've seen in the States overnight, I'm sure some might want to be in Egypt right now, where it's about 92 degrees and sunny. So I'll start out the first part of the presentation today. I'll give us an overall view of the landscape of archives in Egypt. And then the second part, I'll be speaking about my own institution, the Rare Books and Special Collections Library and University Archives at the American University in Cairo. So to start out, Egypt's known for some very important historical bodies of archives. Of course, in the general public imagination, everyone, if they think Egypt, they think things like pyramids and such, mummies. They also think of papyrus. So papyri, of course, are a major form of documentation for Egypt's ancient past, from dating back to almost 3000 BCE through the Greco-Roman period in Egypt and beyond. These finds were made in all sorts of settings. Sometimes, as in the case with this Oxyrhynchus papyri, it was material found as a rubbish dump. And that's a theme that'll come up again and again in terms of the discovery and preservation of archives in Egypt. Other major ancient archives, very well known from the late 19th century, were the Amarna letters, discovered in the capital of Akhenaten along the Nile in Middle Egypt. These were notable because they were not on papyrus, they were not written in hieroglyphic language, but they were cuneiform clay tablets. It was a cache of diplomatic correspondence between the Egyptian state and the representatives among the Canaanites and others. Also, an archive that came to light in the mid-20th century was Nag Hammadi cache of early Christian and Gnostic texts. And these were important for shedding light on early Christianity. A quite notable archive from Egypt is the Cairo Geniza. And this was a body of material found in the Ben Ezra synagogue in one of the older parts of Cairo, one of the early parts of the city. And these have been identified, these had been known in the late 18th through the 19th century, but it was only at the end of the 19th century that they came to the fore as a rich scholastic resource. In essence, according to Jewish tradition, when a document bore the name of God, it could not be just discarded. It couldn't burn, couldn't be destroyed. It had to be collected in a special repository for worn documents. And so this was housed in the synagogue, and it was discovered that these documents, in many ways a random assortment, could reflect all sorts of aspects of life, social life in Egypt among its Jewish community and beyond. So you had business documents, legal documents, correspondence. All this was discovered and had to be sorted and finally preserved. Much of it ended up at Cambridge University through the efforts of Solomon Schechter, a scholar at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. I like this image because it's got a reconstruction of where the repository, the Geniza, where exactly the documents might have been found. So going from ancient to modern, a good place to start is the Alexandria Library. And the Bibliotheca Alexandria was opened in the early 2000s as a sort of effort to as an effort for the rebirth of the ancient library of Alexandria, which famously had been burned in antiquity. And so this, among its many collections, many divisions, which include things like rare books and manuscripts, there are also personal papers collections, like that of the former UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali. The Bibliotheca has made extensive digitizing efforts for Egyptian heritage materials on topics like the Suez Canal and Egyptian presidents. And it has a division that's been dedicated to things like digitizing photographs for non-digitizing the material like that from donors, where the donors retain the material, the library just makes a digital surrogate. And the Bibliotheca is also known for having a mirror version of the Internet Archive. So the Bibliotheca is one in a series of major governmental archives, which are key to the archival scene in Egypt. In Egypt, things are very centralized. So even for example, the centrality of the state in terms of society is quite key. Another major governmental institution is Egypt's National Archives, and this has its roots in the early 19th century. Egyptian ruler Muhammad Ali was very well known for trying to introduce best practices to Egypt in terms of finance, military, state administration. And one of the things he did was to establish a special repository for documents for government use. Now, in the early 1930s, by that time, Egypt had become a monarchy separate from the Ottoman Empire. And King Fuad turned this cache of material into a historical records department within the royal palace. In large part, the aim of doing this was to sort of burnish the Muhammad Ali dynasty from which he descended. There was a national library formed in 1870 in Egypt, housing manuscripts and rare books. And these two institutions were merged with the Nasser, with the revolutionary government in Egypt in the early 1950s. And so bringing these two institutions together was problematic in that the responsibility for government archives was divided between this new National Archives and Library and the Ministry of Finance, which also had an important archive. And so the mandate for ministries to transfer government records was not as strong as it should have been. Now, I mentioned the Ministry of Finance's archives as a major government repository. Other ministries do maintain their own archives, Foreign Affairs, Interior, Defense, and others. Over the years, the resources have not always been dedicated as ideal. And so there were issues of space, documents not being preserved due to lack of space and staff, for example. Now, currently, the government is embarking on a mass digitizing project for government records. Uh, a few years ago, Egypt started construction on a new administrative capital to the northeast of Cairo. And so many of the ministries have already moved out there. And part of the effort is digitizing of government administration and records. With that mass digitizing effort is going on. There's questions though, what will happen to the original documentation? Now, for a number of years, there have been concerns raised by historians, journalists, members of rights groups in Egypt about access limitations to the archives. So, for example, Khaled Fahmy, who's depicted here on the screen, for many years has written about his efforts to use archives that are quite old, Ottoman era Egyptian records, government records, but having to go through a lot of complicated security apparatus approvals. And so that's been a concern that's been raised by many voices about it. What about access to the records, these government documents? The image on the top left of the screen, that's the actually the Ministry of Finance archives up by the Citadel in Cairo. And you'll see it's actually from a rights group that raised concerns about the lack of access. And so you see a couple of band-aids and tape on the image, sort of a criticism of the openness to records. So other important government institutions with archives are museums. In large part, the museum sector in Egypt is governmental sector. And so institutions like the Egyptian Museum of Antiquities and the Geographic Society of Egypt do house historical archives. In large part, these are photographic archives. In the case of the Geographic Society, I just heard from a faculty member who recently took a group of students there for a field trip, and they were shown a cabinet that was filled with daguerreotypes, which hadn't had much intervention, hadn't been used in quite a while. So there are always discoveries to be made in some of these institutions. Now, turning from state to church, church archives are key in Egypt. On the screen here, on the left is the St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai. And if you've been to Egypt as a tourist, that might be one of the locations you visited. It's a Greek Orthodox monastery, and it's famous for its manuscripts. They've been doing a lot of effort to safeguard these and digitize these. Depicted in the photo there is Father Justin, who's actually from Texas, keeper of the library there. But the Coptic Orthodox Church, which is the predominant Christian denomination in the country, their archives and manuscripts are also quite extensive, especially in monasteries. Monasteries, many have libraries filled with manuscripts. There have been cooperative efforts to digitize these, some led by the Hill Manuscript Museum of Minnesota and Father Columbus Stewart. In terms of other Coptic Orthodox church records, there are a lot of material that have a lot of genealogical value. And so those are also being brought to light by partners who are genealogical organizations in places like the US. So Egypt obviously has attracted attention from the wider world for quite a long time. Much of this began with the French Napoleonic expedition to Egypt at the end of the 18th century. Along with bringing soldiers, they also brought scholars and artists and produced the Description of Egypt, which described all aspects of the country. As a successor to this, French-run institutions emerged. A major one is the French Institute for Oriental Archaeology. And so in addition to having archival documentation of archaeological expeditions, they've also been holding some archival records that are largely Francophone. So, for example, artists who are French speaking. They also have an important printing museum. Now, then there's the American Research Center in Egypt, RC, and that has also been very active in expeditions for uh, archaeological work around the country for ancient pharaonic sites. They've also been doing work in restoration of medieval and modern sites in Egypt since the 1990s. Their archive contains documentation for these kinds of efforts. Many photographs, for example. You may see in the depictions of the binders, archival binders, rather boxes at the top of the screen. It does have the USAID label. RC had for many years received a lot of USAID funding for their projects, and unfortunately that has dried up in recent weeks. So turning to the archives of ethnic, foreign, and other religious communities, these kind of records are generally housed by institutions connected to these community groups. An example is the Greek community, used to be one of Egypt's largest foreign communities, much diminished to the present day. Much of the research into the Greek community archives was done by a former colleague of mine, Maria Papanikolaou, who's a Greek national, but who was very interested in the Greek community here. And so she'd done some work visiting with the community in Alexandria and discovering what was happening with their archival repository. In the past, some of the records of the Greek community were sent back to Greece. And so what's currently in the country is not a complete set of records dating back the last few centuries of Greek life in the country. And the kind of records that are present still in Alexandria and in Cairo are newspapers, registration books for births and deaths, documentation for charity associations, and so forth. So the Jewish community has been a very important one in Egypt for centuries. With the Nasser regime, many Jews were required to leave the country, and now the community is down to a total of only 7 individuals. Now, some of the records had been transferred to Israel in the past, but synagogues in Alexandria and Cairo still maintained records until just about a decade ago, where many of these were moved to the National Archives. Most of the heritage preservation work in terms of Jewish documentation now is being run by a local community group, the Drop of Milk Foundation. The Armenian community is another key ethnic group in Egypt. As with the Greeks and as with Jewish records, records have been sent out of the country, in this case to Armenia, but there still are local community organizations that do host material like periodicals of the community. Private other collections are held by institutions. For example, our own library has the Van Leo collection. He was an Armenian Egyptian photographer, and I'll be speaking more about that shortly. Italian community, they've also got a cultural institute that's run by the Italian government, but it has a good deal of documentation about the Italian community, which had been over 50,000 in mid-20th century and is down to just a few thousand at present day. We actually partnered with the Italian Cultural Center and a scholar working with the British Endangered Archives Project to support the digitizing of some of the Italian language periodicals of that community. So, of course, Egypt for many years in the early to mid 20th century, Egypt, well, the British were the colonial powers in Egypt, and The British community left presence as well in terms of community magazines, documentation of British members of churches like the Anglican Cathedral and St. Andrew's United Church, Presbyterian Church. Those churches hold community records related to births and deaths. And there are other foreign communities like the Germans of Cairo. They've also got churches that hold material like that. So something that's not very common in Egypt are archives that are focused around a certain topic or theme. But an important one is the Women in Memory Forum, which has a feminist material library. And it does hold a number of personal papers collections. I think it's perhaps most well known for its oral history archive. Over the last 2 or 3 decades, they've done upwards of several hundred oral history interviews with women in Egypt from various backgrounds, people who made an important contribution to Egyptian society. Now, in terms of specific media formats, there are a number of institutions that support these. A recently formed organization is focused on not necessarily housing photographic collections, but inviting the general public to bring in their family albums. And this archive collective produces digital surrogates, gives them to the donors, and houses a copy themselves. There are other photographic organizations. As far as private galleries, this is not common for photographic focused art galleries, but there is one in Cairo that emerged in the last decade, and that has an impressive collection of art photographers' works. The name of that gallery is Tintera. You can see some of its holdings on the screen. And besides photographic archives, there are film archives. And here you've got individual institutions like Cinematique. It's a downtown organization that houses cinema ephemera. Egypt for many years was known as the Hollywood of the East, and it had a film history dating back to the 1920s. And for the Middle East, it was, it was the center of the cinema industry for the Arabic-speaking world. And so groups like Cinematique are key to preserving that heritage. Some company archives, Bechna was an important film distributor. They maintain the company's film archives and the documentation related to the business of film distribution. Media Production City is a governmental entity, and it's got a cinema restoration center, and that's probably the largest archives of actual films in Egypt. However, safeguarding this film heritage has not been easy. Much of it has left the country. In 2004, a Saudi billionaire prince purchased the film archives of one of the main production companies, which would allow him to present these historical films, these film classics, so to speak, on his satellite television channel. And so they're no longer within Egypt. And this issue of archival heritage leaving the country is something that we'll turn to again later. So an encouraging development are community archives and grassroots projects. These really seem to have emerged at the time of the Egyptian Revolution of 2011. And at that time, a number of groups were founded to document the revolution. Many of these were web-based, using crowdsourcing as their main means of attracting material, things like people's photographs, videos. These groups would do things like conduct oral histories. Many of these are now defunct. The websites no longer operate. an important one that does is 858, which is an impressive video archive related to the revolution. But I think that moment in recent Egyptian history uh, prompted more interest in this kind of community archiving. And so in the last decade, you had efforts emerge that were aiming to document the history of downtown Cairo, which in the last decade has been undergoing a renovation, a rejuvenation. Um, and just in the last few weeks, there's this museum of the people of downtown Cairo that's come about. These kind of efforts really do seem to focus on found ephemera. Uh, so this downtown memory project that emerged shortly after the revolution would partner with the company that was doing most of the restoration and gentrification of the central part of Cairo. And it arranged to have access to apartments as they were emptied out. And if they found photographs or some letters, they would aim to collect these and house these. Uh, in general, I think in the last decade or 15 years, you had a great increase in nostalgia for Egypt among the Egyptian population, nostalgia for an uh, imagined glory days for Cairo, for the country. And so you have many social media sites, Facebook pages that are out there where you can browse images of the Egyptian royal family, pictures of grand hotels, the opera house, Egyptian cinema stars, that sort of thing. And I think that's played a role in this idea of community archives emerging. I think probably the most sustainable community archive now is the SARD, which is an abbreviation for Shubra's Archive. Shubra is a neighborhood in North Cairo, sort of a working class, multi-ethnic neighborhood. Uh, and the founder, a doctoral student, Egyptian doctoral student who's right now studying in the States, he set this up. He actually couldn't register it as an NGO. There are a lot of hurdles to doing that sort of thing here, so he registered it as a private company. Uh, but he's been working with students, with volunteers from the neighborhood to bring in the sort of ephemera people have in their homes, tram tickets, cinema tickets, family photos, that sort of thing, making exhibitions, open houses in the neighborhood to bring people in so they can browse the history of their neighborhood. So that's quite an exciting project right now. Private archives are fairly prevalent in Egypt. The gentleman depicted on the upper left is a descendant of members of the Egyptian royal family and other Egyptian nobility. And so he lives in a mansion in downtown Cairo, and he's preserving his family papers there. He's putting a lot of effort into it, and there's actually been a film documentary made based on his efforts. But you'll find individuals like that who've got extensive family collections who maintain them themselves. From the 1960s, there was a great concern about collections being confiscated by the state, or what would happen to these documents if they made it into government repositories, because if they were from families that came from the so-called ancien regime from before the revolution, would these materials be safeguarded? Would they be treated well? And so there was concern about that, which is why many of these family archives were held privately. Other collectors just have that collecting bug, and so they'll go to places like flea markets, book markets. There's a major Friday market where you can buy everything under the sun in Cairo, and there are sections where there's documentary material. One of these flea markets is shown here on the screen. There are also dealers who are registered booksellers, or they're quite reputable, and they'll sell things like historical magazines, maps, but they'll also from time to time sell things like archival collections of, say, an Egyptian archaeological expedition, records of a scholar who's made it into their bookshop, and they'll put these on offer. Now, a lot of these materials surfaced through the efforts of who I think are some of the archival heroes of Egypt, and these are the garbage collectors of the city. They'll come across piles of trash sent down to the street, which turn out to be archival documents of a business, of a family, sometimes of a government ministry, and they will, instead of sending these to a landfill, they'll offer them to a book dealer for sale. Actually, one of the best things I think about Egypt is that so much is recycled. There really aren't landfills. If something has any ounce of possible life in it, later on, it's refashioned or refurbished or preserved. And the same thing happens with these archives. They're not trashed, they're not destroyed, they're sold. So it's a moneymaker for the trash haulers, and it's a way to allow these collections to persist. On the downside, though, some of these collections really should not end up on the trash heap. They should be transferred to an appropriate repository. That's unfortunately not always the case. I know another individual whose profession basically is to go into apartments as they're emptied. Maybe they're, the children who've inherited the apartment, they just need to clear it out so they can sell it quickly. And so this collector, his main job is to collect things like furniture and things that can be used as props for the cinema industry, but he'll also come across archival documentation, and he's just passionate about keeping it. And it's some amazing material. He's found one notebook which had the sort of rantings of a person who recorded a diary, every possible thought that they had. And it's a little disturbing, but it's an interesting glimpse into a personal life. So he keeps this material. Now, I mentioned archives leaving the country, and that has been a challenge in Egypt. A lot of this happened in the years immediately after the 2011 revolution. So there was a case where many of the archives of the Nobel Literature laureate Naguib Mahfouz ended up in the UK on the Sotheby's auction block. So the question was, how were these smuggled out of the country? There is legislation that bars cultural heritage items from leaving the country. Unfortunately, mostly that's geared toward the attention is on ancient antiquities, Quranic items, for example, and less attention to documentation leaving. That said, when the case is important enough to the government, for example, in the case of Jewish community documents that were discovered and about to be sent out of the country in the early 2010s, the Egyptian government halted that from happening. But there has been a great deal of new attention on this problem. There was a recent conference and publication of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton that brought up this matter, and it hasn't been solved, but it's something that we're aware of. So one sector of archives you may notice I didn't really focus on to this point are universities, university archives, or universities as special collections repositories. And it's really not a major sector in the archival world in Egypt. Of course, university records are held at different universities, maybe under the heading of the library, other departments, but the focus is not on opening this kind of material for research use. There are some special collections in a very limited sense at places like Cairo University, Al-Azhar University, the latter being one of the world's oldest universities. But these largely take the context of museum settings where manuscripts might be on display. Um, to this point, it's not a major sector for archives in the country. So that's an area where I believe that the American University in Cairo uh, plays an important role with its rare books and special collections library. On the screen here, you can see that white villa. That's where I first came to AUC in 2001 when the university was based in downtown Cairo, and the other larger images our current library on the campus in Cairo's suburbs. AUC, the American University, we started in 1919, and as I mentioned, was first based downtown, and in 2009-10, we moved to the suburban campus. AUC's roots lay in American Protestant missionaries who wanted to bring American-style education to the country, and so for the last century plus, AUC has been an English language university based on the American model. Over the years, the missionary emphasis dropped, and so it's a secular institution. The university's made innovations in the country. For example, it introduced student laboratory work in the sciences. It admitted female students in 1928, so actually well before many institutions in the US. And athletics, student athletics were another major innovation. The famous AUC pyramid was something you'll see a lot in early university photos. So these are all areas that are documented by the university archives at AUC. The university archives got its start in the early 1970s. There was a newly hired history professor, came from America to the university and thought, hey, this is an interesting place. It ought to have a book written about it. But he was at a loss. Where can I find material for this? There was no archives. So he basically hunted around the university, and he found on the roof of that building you saw a couple of slides back, all the university's records boxed up sitting on the roof, which says a lot about the climate of Egypt. It doesn't rain much, but it doesn't rain. It rains a bit now.
Steve,
But
we're at 5 minute alert.
sure, absolutely. So fortunately, the climate allowed those documents to be preserved, and that was the basis for the university archives, which documents faculty, student life. About 15 years ago, we started a records management program, and so we have a more systematic way of absorbing records rather than taking them from a rooftop. So the University Archives is based within the Rare Books and Special Collections Library. Its origins lay in the scholar on the screen here. K.A.C. Krezel was a British subject, came here with the British military in World War I. He was one of the pioneers of the study of Islamic art and architecture, built a fantastic library. By the 1950s, he was getting quite old, didn't know what to do with it, so he arranged for it to be sold to AUC. That was accelerated by the 1956 Suez crisis, where Egypt was at war with the British. And so he was able to bring that library to AUC. He was also a prolific photographer of Islamic monuments in Egypt and the region. And so his photograph collection came along with his library, and that formed the basis for the Rare Books Library's current day strengths in photography. He also collected 19th century images from commercial photographers. Now, his library was based in one AUC building, separate from the AUC library. The University Archives were a tiny section of the library. We're talking now the 1980s. In the mid-80s, the library acquired the personal papers of Huda Sharawi, a pioneering Egyptian feminist leader who was also anti-imperialist, wore many other hats. That collection really didn't see the light of day until recent years, but it was the first kind of archival collection that AUC managed. Uh, in recent years, AUC's added other women's collections, other women's archives, and so that's become an important collecting area for us. Uh, Now, in the early 1990s, that Creswell Library, main libraries, scattered special collections, they were all brought together under one roof, Rare Books and Special Collections Library. Its first major archival collection on a large scale was that of Hassan Fatih, Egypt's leading 20th century architect. And so with that collection came amazing drawings, architectural plans of his projects that depicted his work with vernacular local materials like mud brick, domes, as well as his writings, photographs. It's one of our most heavily used collections today. Uh, with his collection coming to the library, those of other major Egyptian modern era architects followed. A main way for AUC taking in collections is through connections with alumni. So Van Leo, the Armenian Egyptian photographer I mentioned earlier, he was an AUC student at one point in the 40s. Throughout the 20th century, he was the leading studio photographer. You'll see Omar Sharif depicted here in one of the images. So he is considered the celebrity photographer of Egypt. And so his connection to AUC led him to donate his collection to the university. Our library has been taking new directions in archival collecting in recent years. The archives of Egyptian Egyptologists, of Egyptian publishers, those represent new directions for us. Crowdsourcing is a major method we've been using in the last decade with the Egyptian Revolution Project to document Egypt's revolution of 2011 through photographs, oral histories, artifacts. And oral history is a very important area in terms of filling the gaps for us. We know that not all the archival documentation will always be there. So we use oral histories with AUC community members. That's been going on for 20 years, building on that historians' oral history recordings. But we also do oral histories with individuals who made major contributions to the country in various fields and members of various community groups. For example, the Jewish community, as well as communities around the country. This is a village in Upper Egypt where we sent a team to do oral histories. We house this oral history material in our digital library through transcripts like this one, and other media collections like the Voice of America Sound Archive, which came to us about a decade ago. That's something we digitized and house in our digital library.
Steve, do you need another minute?
I'm just about wrapping up. Just a couple
Okay.
behind the scenes images of some of our assistants, research assistants and work study students are a major support for us. Image of them at work. The benefit of having multilingual team members, it's a great benefit to us in that we have archival material in multiple languages, of course, Arabic, English, French, etc. And just some snaps of our team, supported by a conservation lab. And that's the archival storage in the background. And just a glimpse at some of our users in the library. And with that, I'll bring it to a close. And
Oh,
thank you so
wonderful.
much.
Oh,
Thank you for having
excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much.
me.
Per usual, I'm going to kick things off with a question, and I'll invite everyone to pose their own question. Um, so, Steve, when it comes to your oral history effort, how do you go about selecting subjects?
Sure. So sometimes people are recommended to us. So someone recently said, "Hey, I know this old man in Port Said. He knows a lot about that city. And so we made contact, and he's sort of a local historian. So we sent someone up to Port Said to do the oral history with him. Other times we might take in an archival collection and we'll do an interview with the donors. So just on Saturday, I interviewed the widow of an important Egyptian artist, puppeteer, uh, interviewed her about his life story, their relationship, their life together. So that's another means. Sometime there'll be some event. Of course, the revolution in Egypt is one example, the key example, I'd say.
Mhm.
Uh, but there was a student on strike. There was a student strike on campus shortly after the revolution, and we figured that, hey, we need to get not only the administration side of this throughout their disciplinary records, but also find out what the students have to say for themselves. And so we had work study students go out among their fellow students and conduct interviews. So those are some of the ways we pursue those.
Shelley has a question in the chat. She's wondering if Egyptian archives have been adversely affected by climate change.
Hmm. I mean, it's generally dry climate, but I have to say that National Archives and Library Building, in one of the earlier slides, was right alongside the Nile, where there is a fair amount of humidity, so that location was not ideal. Uh, we have been seeing a little more instability, but in the climate and patterns here, but not nearly compared to other countries. I think the issue might be that facilities may not be ready for something like a downpour, and sometimes that's the way rain will happen. We only might get rain uh, 2 or 3 times over the course of a winter, but when it does, it'll come down heavily, and perhaps uh, roofing is not made with that in mind. So that's where I would say that would have its greatest impact.
Mhm. Ellen asks, what is the interest in Egypt among archivists and users regarding decolonization efforts or
Mhm.
repatriation of displaced material?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think this has come most to the fore in terms of things like the Rosetta Stone and antiquities of places like the British Museum. Um, it's a concern, and like, the sort of people I mentioned, those collectors that hold on to material that they brought in from the garbage haulers, that sort of thing. They've been made offers in some cases to sell this equipment to institutions, new universities in the Gulf states, for example, and they refuse because they want to keep the material in the country. So I think there is a level of patriotism that supports keeping records here, but of course, there's the financial factor where some people just need the money, and they'll send collections out if they can be compensated.
Mhm.
In terms of decolonization, that's one area where I think, in terms of our pursuing things like the archives of Egyptian archaeologists, that's where we're trying to uh, make our mark and show that it's not just people like Howard Carter who are known internationally, but these other lesser known names that should be brought to the fore. And we
Mhm.
can do that by housing their archives.
I'm curious about the various substrate media in your collection and how you manage taking care of it.
Okay. Do you have anything in particular on that?
I'm thinking everything from stone to film.
Okay. Well, we do take in artifacts with archival collections. So we house the archives of an important Egyptian artist. She was from a Swiss Austrian background, but she lived here 90 years, and her name is Margot Veillon, and she wasn't only a painter. Her painting ran the gamut of artistic styles, but she was really inspired by the nature of Egypt, and so she would travel around the country and take extensive photographs, but she would also collect things like stones and uh, animal bones, pieces of
Mm,
wood. Um, and so we do what we can with those. We try to get advice from the arts department in terms of museum practices for artifacts like that. We've got that voice archive, the sound archive of the Voice of America. Those are reel-to-reel tapes. So
Mm-hmm.
we try to provide, the proper climactic conditions. But we know that they're really not going to get any future use because we have digitized the collection. But nonetheless, we want to make sure they can be maintained as long as possible. Uh, so that is a bit of a challenge in that we don't necessarily have separate rooms for different media.
Right.
A common room for different
Mm-hmm.
kinds of media is something we have to work with.
And what would you say is the most unusual um, record in your holdings?
Oh, it's always a tricky one. It might be the one that we just acquired. We recently acquired the archives of an important mid-20th century film studio, and
Whoa.
it's got everything from posters to promotional cards to film uh, screenplays to the business documents. What's a cameraman getting paid in 1965? But there are
Wow.
also a few some artifacts, or every typewriter they ever used over the span of 50 years, and a couple of props. And one it sort of looks like a rugby ball, and it's a piece of wood. It's meant to be like a date. And so
Oh,
in this one film, the lead actor, it's like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. It's the main actor shrunk to tiny size, and so confronted with a date he had just been about to eat. And so I think I got it wrong. Yeah, so that's generally the idea. So gigantic they have this prop of the date
that's
in
a great
exaggerated
answer.
size. Yeah. But we also have other interesting things. We've got there was a calligrapher in the early 20th century who tried to encourage better handwriting. So he made a series of books in different Arabic typefaces, Arabic calligraphy styles, rather. And so we've got the printing blocks for all of
Oh, nice.
those books. And so you got these beautiful brass strips of Arabic letters in, half a
Mm,
dozen or more styles of Arabic handwriting. So that's always something that visitors love to see. But
yeah.
any of the old hardware, those typewriters, or a
Mhm.
compact computer,
Mm.
1985,
Oh,
the students just, are mystified by these. How did you use these? How do they work? When they see floppy disks in a display on information technology.
oh my gosh.
Yeah. So those are always fun to show to the students.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question, and Shelley has offered it. How active is the archival community in Egypt?
Yeah. I think it's an area where we could probably ramp up some more collaboration. But that said, there's uh, library organizations where my colleagues meet with representatives from the Bibliotheca Alexandrina. We've got very active relationships with various research centers like RC and the French Institute. Uh, we're having, on a fairly regular basis, site visits from our staff to these institutions and from their institutions to ours. So I think there's a fair amount of engagement. There's not really a national society, so there's not exactly an SAA for Egypt. Uh, but uh, but the engagement is there.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, Steve, I cannot thank you enough. I know our attendees are just as thrilled as I am to have spent this last hour with you. So thank you again for joining us all the way from Cairo. I just have a couple of announcements. Today's recorded installment will join past seminars, all of which can be viewed via SAA's YouTube channel and the IAAS Archival Landscapes playlist. The other IAAS program is Archival Vistas Briefings. And I wonder, Jennifer, do you have anything to announce regarding vistas coming up or no?
We have it scheduled for Friday, the 11th of April. And we'll
Mhm.
be having a presentation by Andy Potter. He used to work at the United States National Archives. He'll be discussing the IAAS standards in relation to archives and records management. So keep an eye on your email, because very soon we'll be having information going out about that and how you can register.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Jennifer. Our next landscape seminar will take place in mid-May and feature an archives tradition from Asia. So be on the lookout for more information about that. We are thrilled to have had this hour together with you. I want to thank Steve again for joining us and certainly our audience for attending. And we hope to see you at our next landscape seminar. Have a great day, everyone. Bye for now.
Thanks so much.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye. I'm going to stop recording.